Hey, 42 here. Food is an enormous part of our lives. It affects our moods, changes our bodies, it's a key part of our culture and celebrations, and for many of us is a large part of what we think about during the day. In fact, you could go as far as to say that the whole idea of civilization is completely down to food. Since it was the collaboration we learnt through hunting and then the communities we built through agriculture that created villages and towns, as well as technology. But if you take that sandwich out your mouth for a second, do you ever wonder how it ended up on your plate? Where did they grow the wheat to make the bread? What pig did the ham come from? Why did they put pickles in it? They know you hate pickles. All very important questions. So today, we're going to have a quick look at the major problems facing food. Glorious food. Most of the world is omnivorous. We eat meat and plants. Although vegetarianism and veganism are on the rise, the numbers are still relatively low. India is way ahead with 40% of the country being vegetarian, but in almost every other nation it's well under 10%. Animal farming, or husbandry as it's called, began in the Neolithic era, some 12,000 years ago. We began to selectively breed the traits we wanted into cattle and other livestock, making them fatter and more docile. Because, let's be honest, you'd rather deal with this than this every morning. As society grew, meat was more commonly the food of the upper classes, since you needed to invest in the care of the animals first in order to eat it, especially if you lived in a city so far from any hunting grounds. You can even see this reflected in the English language. The words for meat generally come from French. Beef, bœuf, mutton, mouton. The English royalty normally spoke in French, and they were the ones eating the animals. But the lower classes, those of Germanic origin, farmed the animals, so the actual creature names normally come from German and Dutch. Cow, koe, sheep, schaap. And this leads us to our current problem. As countries grow richer, you can see their meat consumption increasing, since it is seen as part of a wealthier lifestyle. China is a great example of this. According to the OECD, by 2024, China will be eating over 10% more beef, almost 25% more poultry, and 5% more pork. But they have a long way to go to catch up with the carnivorous competition. The USA is the world's biggest meat lover, chowing down on over 120 kilograms per person every year. That's the weight of 2 average adults. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that Americans eat people, with or without fava beans. Australia and New Zealand are the only other countries who manage over 100 kilograms annually. Australia because of their barbecue culture, and New Zealand because, well, what else were they supposed to do with all those orcs after the Battle of Mordor? Producing all this meat uses up an enormous amount of resources, and is one of the biggest contributors to climate change. The main problem is that it leads to our never-ending deforestation, especially in South and Central America. Since the start of this video, another 2 square kilometers of trees have been felled down. They use the land as space for animals, but also they grow feed for them, such as corn and soya, and less trees means less CO2 being absorbed from the atmosphere. It also really messes up hide and seek. The second issue is that these animals produce a lot of gas, especially cows. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, and our bovine friends produce 120 kilograms of it a year. That's 1,000 times more than a human. So cows are terrible roommates, especially with their appalling taste in music. The way we keep huge herds of animals together also means the risk of disease spreading is far higher than it used to be, and much faster. Outbreaks of things like avian flu resulted in the mass cullings of millions of poultry in an effort to limit it. Many animals are given antibiotics, but regulations are changing now since they become less effective over time and can lead to the evolution of a superbug. What do you think was the first animal we started breeding? Of course, it was the dog, and we began doing it over 30,000 years ago. So that is how long we have been genetically modifying the life around us. The huge varieties of breeds of dogs are all descended from wolves, but we have been using artificial selection as opposed to natural selection for tens of thousands of years. A scientist called Dmitry Belyaev tried to look at how the process works by doing the same thing with foxes in Siberia. From 1959, he started selecting the friendliest foxes and killing the rest, so that their tameness quality would become a part of the breed. The experiment went on for some 40 years. They didn't have anything better to do in Siberia. But the results were pretty impressive. The foxes could be walked and act as pets. The most interesting part was that they displayed similar changes to domestic dogs with their floppy ears and differently patterned fur. Just look at a wolf's ears and then at a dachshund. They are so different. But we weren't breeding dogs to have floppy ears. What would be the point? It turns out that a friendlier, tamer animal is one that has a lower epinephrine level, also called adrenaline. So different hormone levels led to different physical developments. It also affected melanin production, which is what gives the fur its colour. So that's why they saw changes there as well. Our artificial selection was not limited to animals, of course. Almost every crop, fruit and vegetable in the supermarket today has been altered from its original form, by farmers selecting the best traits that they want and mixing the plants where they can. The lemon is a great example of this, being a hybrid of the citron and the bitter orange. Without mankind's input, it's unlikely that the lemon would exist today, and no gin and tonic would ever be good enough. Then the big jump came with the discovery of DNA. Frederick Misha first isolated it in 1869, and then Watson and Crick gave us the famous double helix structure that we know today in 1953. By 1982, we had the first patented GM organism, an oil-eating microorganism owned by the Exxon Oil Company, designed to eat up oil spills. So, how do you genetically engineer an organism? How do you splice a tomato with a fish, for example? This was a real thing, by the way. They were using the antifreeze gene of the white flounder fish to help tomatoes survive better in the frost. Apparently, hats and scarves were not an option. So here's a very basic overview of how genetic engineering works. DNA is a group of molecules in the form of a double helix, and they combine in pairs to make strands called chromosomes. For humans, there are 46 chromosomes, and together these make up our genome. So it's this collection of information that makes a human, a dog, and a cat a mean, ungrateful psychopath with a cute face. You search through genomes for the traits you want, bigger leaves for example, less water usage, fishy freeze proofing, whatever you're after. Then you isolate the bit of the genome that manages that trait and you cut it out, using enzymes. It's just easier than scissors apparently. You then stick that bit of the genetic material into a thing called a plasmid, which is sort of like an extra storage space you find in some bacteria. Now you need to put it into the cells you want to modify. You can literally fire it in with a thing called a gene gun, using tiny metal particles as bullets. You can also use bacteria that will infect the cells you want to change, and your genetic code can just hop out, like a Trojan jumping out of one of those wooden horses they love so much. Our main use for GMOs is as crops, and we use the process to make plants more resistant to the problems of their environment, potentially giving farmers a far bigger harvest. In the US alone, it's reported to have increased agricultural production by almost $100 billion. The ability to alter crops quickly if the environment changes will also be a massive help, especially if you want to move away from meat consumption. So, what is the big controversy around GMOs? Well, so far, there is no scientific evidence that they are in any way unsafe or detrimental to human health. But many people wonder if it's such a good idea to be poking around with life in this way. It's not just the GMOs that we have changed, since they also affect the environment around them too, such as the animals that need the GMO crops to survive. As we learnt in the documentary Jurassic Park, when you mess about with life, things can go wrong pretty quickly. Oh, that wasn't a documentary. From mildew on our lettuce to flies in our soup and ants in our pants, it sometimes feels like we're in an endless war to keep pests off our stuff. They are the annoying little brothers of the animal world, and this is why we turn to our weapon of bug destruction, the pesticide. For farmers, there are a number of ways you can lose yield. Animals, insects, diseases, and weeds, as well as extreme weather events such as drought and flooding. The yield is the actual amount of usable product you end up with, so that would be the edible grain for corn, the white fibre for cotton. If we let everything grow completely unassisted, it's estimated we would lose 80% of all cotton, 50% of wheat, and over 30% of most other key crops. There are a number of ways we try to combat this, such as mechanically tilling the ground, and using software to plant in the best places at the best times, and lots of others. But it is still weeds and insects that are the biggest issues. So we turn to herbicides and pesticides. The Sumerians are the earliest users of pesticides, using a sulfur compound to control insects and mites about 4,500 years ago. But as technology developed and our understanding of plants grew, we were able to create better targeted protections. Today, one of the most widely used is the notorious herbicide Roundup, made by Monsanto. Roundup is mainly glyphosate, and it works by inhibiting an enzyme called EPSP synthase that plants need to survive. But if it kills all plants, then isn't that farming genocide? Well, this is where the GMOs come in. Companies have designed crops that don't have an enzyme that does what EPSP does, but isn't affected by Roundup. Okay, so if we're spraying this on our food, is it safe? Yes and no. You certainly wouldn't want to do shots of it, and it will irritate your skin if you touch it. But given the huge quantities that are used globally, it's fairly safe to say that it's not dangerously toxic, since most of us are ingesting traces of it pretty regularly. The World Health Organization have said that glyphosate is probably a carcinogen. It causes cancer. But the amounts required would be much, much higher than would ever be in the food people are eating. The big issues here are that since glyphosate kills most plants, it can easily get into the water and damage the surrounding environment, including aquatic flora. There have also been new weeds appearing that are now resistant to the herbicide, and it's been suggested that the overuse of glyphosate has accelerated this process, because evolution is all about repetition. So, if you want to avoid pesticides, just go organic, right? Well, I'm afraid not. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings in the supermarket. Up there with why haven't they opened a third lane? Why is that woman buying just cat food and ice cream? And were self-service machines invented by Satan? Organic farming uses pesticides all the time. They are just not allowed to use any that are made synthetically, and they don't use any GMOs. There is no specific limit on the volume of chemical used either, so you can end up spraying a crop 7 to 8 times, whereas a GMO crop might only need 2 sprays. The organic food market is now huge business, and one of the world's leading organic supermarkets, Whole Foods, now has a similar revenue to Monsanto, $12.9 billion to Monsanto's $15.9 billion. So don't expect this fight to end anytime soon. The real battleground of the food industry is in the supermarket. Companies scrap for price position on the shelves and fight it out over prices. It's a shame that no one has accidentally killed off Brussels sprouts yet. No one likes you, sprouts. Almost nothing in a supermarket is random. The entire layout and position of each product and promotion has been carefully calculated by some very clever algorithms. The main purpose of loyalty cards is not to make sure you keep coming back to the supermarket. It's so they can get some basic demographical information about you, and then everything you buy is connected to that data. Now they can build profiles of what people of different ages, backgrounds, incomes, etc. are buying. This then determines which products they promote and how they lay out the aisles. Basically, it's game over as soon as you walk through the door. Do you ever look down at the mountain of stuff you just bought on the checkout and think, all I wanted was some milk? But this need for supermarkets to force consumers to buy endless crap they don't need leads to one major problem: waste. The oranges need to be completely round, the bananas need to be just the right curve, and the sprouts need to be the perfect flavour of disgusting. And then everything must be labelled with various expiry dates and best before dates and display until dates, some of which are pretty meaningless. It's just there to act as legal protection for the supermarkets so that they are always selling an optimum product. Thanks to these factors, the world wastes 1/3 of all the food we produce. In fact, rich countries waste about 222 million tonnes every year, which is almost as much food as is produced in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. In the UK, households throw out about 6.7 million tonnes a year, despite the fact that over 60% of it could have been eaten if we had just managed it better. To give you an example, the British chuck out over 1 million pots of yoghurt every day, unopened. But that date on the yoghurt doesn't mean it's bad, it's just the only date that the company will guarantee its quality up to. If you're worried about it being full of bacteria, then you clearly don't understand what a yoghurt is. Some countries are now taking steps to limit this, and this year France passed a law that prevents supermarkets over 400 square meters in size from throwing away any unsold food. Now charities and food banks get the food instead, for free, to distribute to the poor and homeless citizens. This puts an end to the unpleasant practice of deliberately spoiling food with bleach or other chemicals to prevent people from taking it out of the dumpsters. Another crazy thing about the supermarkets is that when you walk in and you look at those never-ending lines of cereals and ice creams and shower gel and soda, it feels like you have an almost infinite choice. But it's all an illusion, especially in the US. For Americans, almost everything in the supermarket comes from just 20 companies, and that includes the organic stuff. If it's cereal, it's probably Kellogg's or Nestle. If it's ice cream, it's probably Unilever. If it cleans your house or your head, it's probably Procter & Gamble. Try not to get those mixed up though, because no one wants Pantene on their carpets. Even meat production is basically for companies, like JBS, who control 1/4 of US cattle. In almost every area of food production, there are just a handful of companies with a monopoly over the market. The supermarkets themselves are also enormous. Walmart, for example, is the world's largest corporation, employing over 2 million people and taking almost $500 billion in revenue every year. That's more than all of South Africa. Next up, you have the British Tesco, and the membership-only Costco, and the French Carrefour. Each of these is about 1/4 of the size of Walmart. It's not all doom and gloom though. The rise of globalization has given many of us access to an amazing array of produce and dishes that would have been unimaginable just a couple of generations ago. Your grandparents would have been shocked just to find strawberries in December. And there you are dipping sushi into mango chutney because you ran out of gluten-free pumpkin spiced bagels. That is not a good dinner, by the way. What would your mother say? Thanks for the view, subscribe for more. 42.